welcome back. So now we're going to talk about how women of color are perceived, and it's really interesting. I will do a postmodern linked to another presentation. Right, so it's a presentation within a presentation. All right, so we're talking about assimilation, how Asian American women and women of color are treated. So I'm going to read our slide. Furthermore, Ports and Zhao, 1993, elaborate on Rumbold's 1990, quote, mode of incorporation. This concept to argue that the paths taken by immigrants also depend on the context of the reception. So these contexts include 1, policies of the host government, 2, racial encounters in the receiving country, and 3, the ethnic makeup of the co-ethnic community. So here I could use the example of Cubans, right? Now, if you're an escapee from Cuba and you roll onto our U.S. islands, what happens to you? Do you get shipped back like many thousands of Mexican Americans or Mexicans are? No, you're given a preliminary citizenship. You're given actually some sort of voucher where you can actually gain a very quick route to U.S. citizenship. That's very contrasting to how Haitians are treated, right, when they colonize shores. For children of immigrants, 3 additional factors also contribute to downward mobility. Okay, so write this down. 3 additional factors contribute to, quote, downward mobility. So this is like the theories that immigrants can never achieve, they never can do. It's like the opposite model minority. Asian Americans can never achieve, they never can do well, okay? And one is skin color, okay? Are you dark-skinned? Location, do you live currently in an ethnoburb, right? I would argue that's probably not assimilated. So if you're a student here, you're living in San Gabriel Valley, Alhambra, Rosemead, Monterey Park, does that mean that you're not assimilated? And also the absence of mobility ladders, right? Are you getting into college or you're not? In other words, the presence of racial discrimination and prejudice, close contact with underclass minorities, and the lack of economic opportunities can deter upward mobility. So if you look at Southeast Asians in particular, we're talking about the 3rd generation on welfare. Once again, the 3rd generation. Okay, so that goes smack against the model minority myth. Since the advent of segmented theory, numerous studies have emerged to provide the empirical application of this study. And later on, I will talk about Min Zhao's and Port's. They actually elaborate on this theory. They have this theory called segmented theory. We'll talk about later in another slide. Are Asians different? Do they have a racial uniform? Is their language very unique and they cannot be assimilated? Do they have a different cultural background from the incorporating surrounding background, and do they not, and will they not be assimilatable possible? Okay. So now I'm going to play kind of this really interesting postmodern. The video's not postmodern, but what I'm doing is postmodern. Okay. I'm going to play a double Jeopardy video by another professor at Berkeley, and she's going to talk about how Asian American and Latinas and African Americans are treated and interpolated. Okay, so I'm going to play maybe around 10-20 minutes of it.
Differs by race, not much. There is a little literature that talks about how gender bias differs by race, not much. The most famous example is from Francis Beale in the 70s, who forwarded what we call the double jeopardy hypothesis, that if gender bias had a negative effect for white women, it had a doubly negative effect for women of color. This double jeopardy hypothesis is one hypothesis about how gender bias differs by race. Scholars such as Cecilia Ridgway have a different hypothesis. They have argued, as a theoretical matter, that subordinated statuses like gender and race are additive. But the question is, are they additive? Do they multiply? Or is the interaction just something that's more subtle? So the 35 years of literature on gender bias typically compares women to men. And we know that the unmarked category of women in the United States is white women. And so if you just ask people to compare women to men, you tend to get data about white women. So what I have done is taken that 35 years of literature and organized it into 4 basic patterns of gender bias. And what this module does is it develops some hypotheses on how each of these 4 patterns differs by race. Now I'm talking about how gender bias differs by race. There's another related topic, how racial bias differs by gender. Related, a little bit different. I'm going to focus on the first. The reason this is an important project is that I think that white women sometimes forget that building a coalition around gender means that you're building an interracial coalition. And that, to build that kind of coalition requires some self-reflection and specific kinds of political work. Specifically, if you're just talking about gender, typically you're only talking, as we mentioned, to white women. How do you bring women of color into the coalition and create a truly interracial coalition, particularly in view of the fact that it means something different for women of color to identify first by gender than it does for white women to do that. Okay, let's start exploring these 4 patterns of gender bias. There are 4 patterns of gender bias. The first is called prove it again. That's the first of the 2 glass ceiling patterns. The second glass ceiling pattern is called the tightrope. That describes how women have to walk a tightrope between being too masculine and being too feminine. The third pattern is actually the strongest pattern. That's called the maternal wall, gender bias triggered by motherhood. And then the final pattern, called tug of war, or gender wars, discusses situations where gender bias against women turns into fights among the women. Let's start with the first glass ceiling pattern, prove it again. The default assumption in high status, historically male jobs, and the professor is one, the scientist is another, is if you think about a brilliant scientist right away, most people will think about a middle-aged white man. And so women typically don't fit as well into that image as men do. If you think about a go-getter, typically someone will think about someone who is aggressive, outspoken, unemotional, very competitive. All of those are qualities that we associate with masculinity and men. Whereas if you think about the typical woman, most people will think of someone who is warm, friendly, and nice. Not much of an overlap there between go-getter and typical woman. Because of this lack of fit, one of the things that happens is that women's successes tend to be coded very differently than men's successes. This is a pattern often called he's skilled, she's lucky. So if a man has a success, it tends to be attributed to skill, whereas if a woman has a success, it tends to be attributed to something transient, like luck. The opposite actually goes for failures. The second pattern is called casuistry, and that is a pattern whereby whatever the qualification of the man, that is what people say is important for the job. So this comes from an experiment where when people were handed resumes where the man had more experience, they said experience was more important for the job. And then when they were handed resumes where the man had more education, they said more education was necessary for the job. Another prove it again pattern concerns the fact that men tend to be judged on their potential, whereas women are judged on their achievements, solely what they've already achieved. And you can see how these patterns add up and make it so that women have to prove themselves over and over and over again. A related pattern is who's considered a risk. Often women are considered to be riskier than men are. Again, they have to give more evidence of competence before someone feels comfortable, for example, giving them a promotion or a new job title. In addition, there's what's called recall bias, that women's mistakes tend to be noticed and remembered, whereas men's are soon forgotten. And finally, women tend to get polarized evaluations. Women who are superstars actually tend to get higher evaluations than similar men. But women who are only outstanding tend to get much, much lower evaluations. So those are the basic prove it again patterns. So let's transition now over to try to examine how this prove it again pattern differs by race. There are not many studies. I'll mention those that exist. Beginning with African American women, it seems likely that they trigger two sets of negative competence assumptions, and so the double jeopardy hypothesis may be correct on this prove it again axis. And there's one study that seems to confirm this. It showed that black women are showed that black women are punished more harshly than either white women or black men for the same mistake. So it does seem to be a double burden. On the other hand, there's another study that showed that black professionals are rated nearly as high in competence as white professionals are. So that seems to muddy the water. Here's a quote. "It's difficult being a black woman because everyone expects you to fail. Or if you didn't fail, they think it was because of charity, not your own merit." If we shift over to Latinos, Latinos in general are rated as even lower in competence than African Americans. Here's a quote. "You always have to prove yourself that you're just as good. You almost have to fight harder to demonstrate that you can do a job just as well." There is also some evidence that Latinos in the United States operate under what's called an immigration shadow, that the assumption, no matter how long they have been here or what their class status is that they just came over on the boat. And that also, of course, can trigger in these high-status jobs negative competence assumptions. As we transition to Asian Americans, the situation becomes complicated. If an Asian American is seen through the model minority stereotype, the stereotype that Asian Americans work very hard, do well educationally, stay out of trouble, but lack social skills, then it's possible that Asian American women will have to give actually less evidence of competence than white women do, because she will be helped by the high competence model minority stereotype. The downside of that stereotype, of course, is that the model minority stereotype communicates that Asian Americans are very good for on technical work, but not good on leadership skills. So that's one possibility. One thing to remember is that studies do show that Asian Americans are seen as equally competent as whites. What if the Asian American, instead of being viewed through that model minority stereotype, is viewed through the lotus blossom stereotype, the stereotype of Asian American women who are sexualized, passive, demure? If an Asian American woman is viewed through that stereotype, she's probably more in the situation of other women of color, where she has to give even more evidence of competence than a white woman in order to be seen as equally competent with white men. So that's the first glass ceiling pattern, prove it again. Let's talk now about the second glass ceiling pattern, called the tightrope. That describes the fact that women often find in these historically male jobs that they have to walk a tightrope between being seen as too feminine or too masculine. Here's a quote. "To get ahead here at MIT, you have to be so aggressive. But if women are too aggressive, then they're ostracized. And if they're not aggressive enough, then they have to do twice the work." And so you see there that women have a very narrow path they have to negotiate. What the studies show is that often women find they have to choose between being liked but not respected, that's the too feminine problem, or respected but not liked, That's the too masculine problem.
Particularly women of color are treated. During this time, if you're by yourself, this is probably the time to cuss. Mother effer! Is this what the... Yes, this is probably the time. Alright, ladies, I'm looking at you. If you're watching this video, I'm looking at you. I'm motioning towards you. I'm asking you the questions. Guys, I want you to listen. This is an issue for women of color, but also white women, okay? So let's talk about her findings, and what do you guys think? She has a fake background. She's a fake, she has a fake, what's it called? Books, just like me. She's a fake bookshelf. Awesome. All right, I selected mine, okay, from a long list. All right, so let's look at the first findings. Latinos are rated lower than African Americans, right, in terms of competence, right? They have something called the immigration shadow, okay? African American women are not liked either way, but are more likely to be seen as leaders. And for our class, and we will talk further on next time, is Asian Americans, right? Asian Americans can be seen in two lights, particularly Asian American women. A, the model minority myth, right, where they're too competent, too high degree, kind of a threat, right? Kind of like a curve breaker. Or the opposite, where they're seen as demure, the lotus blossom, the sexualized, thinking back of our stereotypes, right? You can see how it's either right or left, right? You're either way, it seems kind of a negative portrayal. So ladies, at this time you can write some cuss words or you can just say it, okay? Guys, you can just listen. This is huge. This is, it's very interesting how women of color are treated so differently, interpreted different, right? So they're seen differently and they're interpreted differently. That's going to affect how they see themselves, right? Their own ethnic identity. So I'm going to end this slide, this section, with the tightrope, okay? So Asian women, not Asian American women, but women in general, particularly women of color and also Euro-Anglo women, they have the tightrope. So I'm talking to you ladies out there. Which one do you want to be? So ladies, do you want to be liked but not respected? Okay. You're liked but you're not expected. You might get fired. Or do you want to be respected and not liked? Right? Which one? Okay. They're both pretty negative, right? You're kind of like the double bind, the double Jeopardy. I think it's a great video. Kind of like a complex question. You just can't win. So now I want, so guys, imagine all the women are going, what the bleep, right? I want you guys to think about that. You know, how women are interpolated, how women of color in particular are interpolated, and how that affects their ethnic identity, okay? And in particular, how Asian American women are interpolated. All right, so that's it, and I will see you next time, and thank you so much.